Good morning. I am Susan Stevens Chambers. I am on the worship committee, chair of the worship committee here at Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and I'm serving as worship associate this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Mankato. All of you, whether you're joining us in person or are on Zoom, you're welcome in this time that we make sacred together. And we extend an especially warm welcome to you if this is your first time here. We know and appreciate that it can be difficult to cross the threshold of a new church for the first time, whether in person or online. We humbly acknowledge that before European colonization, the Dakota people were stewards of the land on which our fellowship building sits. They teach us that the land does not belong to any of us, though it holds the history of our conflicts and our attempts at reconciliation. And we commit to an ongoing and intentional journey of humble connection with Indigenous peoples, characterized by understanding our shared history, accepting responsibility for restoration, and building relationship in the here and now. Thus, we seek to be good relatives. Sunday morning is a team effort, and I'm grateful to all of you willing to serve. Thanks to our pianist, Shay McKay, and Director of Children's Faith Development, Macy Forsyth, has recorded a story for our worship time. Children's Chapel will be led by Danielle Stedman. Nursery care is provided by Karen Knox and Deanne Nelson. And thanks to our tech squad, Andy Roberts and worship tech Kat Clemens. And thank you also to Denny Cramblett for taking care of hearing assistance. And to our greeters, Catherine Vanderhaar and Diana Rule. Thank you to all. If you are new to the fellowship, we're grateful that you are expanding the we who is us. And if you're attending by Zoom today, you're welcome to stay after the service to chat together. And for those attending in person, we have coffee and refreshments in the fellowship hall. Thanks to Alicia Bayer. We do have a couple of announcements today. We're in need of more people to take turns in the various roles that make Sunday mornings possible. We're especially in need of more people to take turns assisting Kat with the technical needs during worship. But there are many other opportunities as well. There's a clipboard on the hutch in the entryway for you to sign up for one or more ways of serving. And you can still use the Sign Up Genius through our website. So please, come join us and volunteer. Together, let us kindle a flame, symbolizing our co-creation of sacred space at home and in this place made sacred by years of love. And as you do, please write in the chat that a chalice is lit on your street. And all of us, please say the words with me on your pew cards. We are a welcoming people of diverse beliefs who commit to nourish the spirit, broaden the mind, nurture the earth, and build community. May this flame we kindle remind us to strive today and every day to love beyond belief. Condensed from themes in North American Unitarian Universalist history from the UUA Tapestry of Faith curriculum called the New UU. Though it has roots going back to early Christianity, Unitarian Universalism as an organized movement on this continent comes from two particular religious traditions, Unitarianism and Universalism, which consolidated in 1961 to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. Both Unitarians and Universalists resisted and challenged codified beliefs. Initially, Unitarianism developed with the Standing Order Churches of Massachusetts, the direct descendants of the Puritans and Pilgrims. Some ministers started to preach about the ability of people to become more like God and cited Jesus as an example rather than as a savior. Orthodox ministers and church members interpreted this new movement as a violation of creeds accepted within the church. They worked to exclude the new way of thinking and those who promoted it. But the heretics who came to be called Unitarians refused to leave their congregations. Many a congregational battle was pitched, usually over the calling of an unorthodox minister. When the Orthodox lost, they often left their churches. Many New England town squares still feature a Unitarian church near a congregational, now the United Church of Christ church, a circumstance that dates to this tumultuous time at the beginning of the 19th century. Ironically, Unitarians were labeled for their idea of God, a single God, rather than a Trinity, which was not as central to their thinking as their concept of human beings as more divine than depraved. Universalists, on the other hand, left their churches over the heretical idea that God would ultimately save all people, not just those who were chosen or those who believed. Rejecting the idea of hell, they had set aside part of the creed, so they too rejected creeds. Later, challenges arose in both Unitarianism and Universalism about whether it was necessary to be Christian or even to believe in God. Many Unitarians, especially Westerners, joined the Free Religious Association, insisting on absolute freedom of conscience, a notion which, despite arguments, prevailed. Universalists, though a bit more conventional, consistently added a conscience clause to their statements of faith. By the 20th century, they too, as a group, had set aside many conventions of Christianity. Both Unitarians and Universalists have focused on this world rather than the next. Their this world orientation has often moved them to the leading edge of social change. Examples of Unitarian and Universalist work to build a beloved community include: Universalists issued a statement against slavery in 1790. Many active 19th century abolitionists were Unitarian or Universalists. Unitarians, especially Henry Whitney Bellows, were among the founders of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which improved conditions for soldiers in the Civil War. Universalists were the first religious body to ordain a woman, Olympia Brown, in 1863. Unitarian and Universalists, from Horace Mann to the Transcendentalists, to Agnes MacLean and Sophia Lynn Fawes, champion progressive education. The 20th century saw Unitarians active with the NAACP, including John Haynes Holmes, an early member, and A. Powell Davies. Many Unitarians and Universalists have been pacifists, including a few like John Haynes Holmes, who opposed both world wars. Proportionately, more clergy from Unitarian Universalist congregations than from any other religious group answered Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to Selma and to march for voting rights in 1965. Unitarian Universalists passed their first resolution for gay, lesbian, and bisexual rights in 1970 and have supported equal marriage strongly across the continent.
So you may not know yet about me that I'm a history buff, so we're going to dive into our history some today. One of the things that I love about serving this particular congregation is that we both do our best to honor our history and work to be a congregation that is relevant and vital in the 21st century. That is also true of our larger faith. Our Unitarian Universalist history is a rich one, including the histories of our Unitarian and Universalist religious ancestors before those two faiths merged in 1961, as we heard in the reading. There are so many stories that we can not only celebrate as proud parts of our past, but also be inspired by as we choose again and again what kind of community to be now, in this historic moment in which we live. Today, we're just going to hear a sampling of those stories. Some of them may be familiar to many of you because they are among our more famous history stories, and others are less well known. As you listen, I invite you to think about what message these ancestors have for us as 21st century Unitarian Universalists. In 1553, long before there was a denomination called Unitarian, Michael Servetus was burned at the stake in Geneva, partially for writing on the errors of the Trinity, which was not actually even anti-Trinitarian in a strict sense, but challenged the traditional understanding of the Trinity. Even as he burned, he refused to recant his beliefs. Just 15 years later, in 1568, still in a time where it was common for kings to make their own religion the official religion of their whole countries and require adherence to it by all of their citizens, a Unitarian king, John Sigismund of Transylvania, chose to give his people an uncommon, though not complete, degree of religious freedom by issuing the Edict of Torda, which acknowledged 4 religions within Transylvania rather than declaring Unitarianism the state religion. The edict explicitly allowed debate to include both Trinitarian and anti-Trinitarian theologies. It allowed religious communities to select their own preachers, and it declared that those preachers should not be punished for their views, as Servetus had been. In May 1819, in a time when our religious ancestors were still liberal Christians within the congregational denomination that Sue mentioned in the reading, and the word Unitarian, with a small u, was used as an insult, William Ellery Channing preached a sermon titled Unitarian Christianity. Now, these days, it might be the Christianity part of that title that would raise eyebrows if I were to preach that sermon. But in Channing's time, it was the word Unitarian. 2 years after his sermon, though, over 100 Congregationalist churches had declared themselves to be Unitarian. 6 years after his sermon, a group of ministers created the American Unitarian Association, which is one of the precursors to our Unitarian Universalist Association today. In a time when slavery was still legal and only white landowning men had the right to vote in the United States, some Unitarians and Universalists worked to make freedom and the right to vote a reality for everyone. Notice I said some. Not even all of the people in our faith agreed about these issues. So it was even more brave of those who spoke against slavery and those who wanted everyone to be able to vote. While Unitarian minister Theodore Parker was hiding fugitive slaves, many Unitarians in Boston and in the South many of whom owned slaves or profited from industries dependent upon slavery. Many of them supported the Fugitive Slave Act. In 1850, Parker was indicted by a federal grand jury for obstructing a federal marshal who was pursuing a fugitive slave in Parker's congregation. Even after that indictment, Parker hid fugitive slaves in his home, helped finance slave insurrections, preached passionately against slavery and in favor of women being granted the right to vote. And it is said, though not documented for certain, that he actually kept a pistol in his pulpit in case someone came for one of those fugitive slaves in his congregation. Some of those who were working to get women the right to vote still thought it should only be white people who voted, even after slavery ended. But some people did want those rights for every single person. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born in 1825 to free black parents in a slave state. After the Fugitive Slave Act was passed when she was a young woman, she moved to Philadelphia, where she joined the Unitarian congregation and committed herself to the abolitionist movement. She soon had a full-time job traveling throughout New England giving lectures against slavery. It's also interesting to note that 100 years before Rosa Parks, Frances also refused to give up her seat on a segregated trolley car. When the Civil War ended, Harper waged a dual campaign for women's suffrage and for civil rights for all citizens. In May of 1866, she delivered an address to the National Women's Rights Convention in New York, saying before thousands of people, "Justice is not fulfilled so long as woman is unequal before the law. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul." In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and about a dozen other women were arrested for voting in a presidential election. The other women were held for $500 bail, and Anthony for $1,000. She was denied a trial by jury, she lost her case, and she was fined $100, which she proudly never paid. She never stopped working for women's right to vote, though she would not live to see that right granted. Phoebe Hannaford was a teacher, a successful author, and a fighter against slavery and for the right of women to vote. When she became the first female Universalist minister to be ordained in New England, she was called to serve at a church in Connecticut. Her Baptist husband refused to follow her, so Phoebe separated from him. While she was busy serving as a successful minister, she was also still very active in working for women's rights. Her church in Jersey City, New Jersey, decided to fire her after her first 3 years of ministry, even though the church had doubled in size. At first, the church tried to push her out by lowering her salary by 25%. Phoebe accepted the pay cut, so church leaders voted not to renew her contract, claiming the reason was, quote, because she was spending too much time working on women's issues. Phoebe's letters make it clear that the church was also upset about her relationship with a woman named Ellen Miles, who they referred to as the minister's wife. They insisted that Phoebe give up both her work for women's rights and her relationship with Ellen. Phoebe refused, and in response, she and her supporters started the Second Unitarian Church of Jersey City in a building across the street from her previous church. The Sunday school there was run by her partner Ellen, with whom she lived for another 40 years until Ellen's death. Phoebe was politically active for the rest of her ministry career and beyond, speaking at conventions for women's rights around the country, doing everything in her power to bring women the right to vote. It says something both about her gifts as a speaker and her importance to the women's movement that she was asked to conduct the funeral services for both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the two most famous leaders of the movement. At the age of 91, Phoebe was one of the few early suffragists who lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. In 1917, when just about everyone else in the United States, including most Unitarians and most Universalists, supported our nation's entry into World War I, John Haynes Holmes said that war and Christianity were not compatible. He risked the condemnation of his colleagues and his whole community, but he held true to his belief in pacifism. While he didn't lose his pulpit for preaching pacifism, 9 of the 15 openly pacifist Unitarian clergy during World War I did lose their pulpits. In 1939, on the brink of another world war, Waitstill Sharp and his wife Martha left their 2 small children with close friends from their congregation in Massachusetts and went to Prague to help refugees who were fleeing Nazi persecution. They helped hundreds escape over just a few months. Martha, who left Prague a week after her husband, avoided arrest by the Gestapo by just 1 day. The Sharps went on to co-found the Unitarian Service Committee, for which our flaming chalice symbol was first created, and continued their work in Europe under the USC's auspices. They have been honored by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Authority in Israel, as righteous among the nations. In 1971, researcher and whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg gave photocopies of a classified Pentagon review of our government's involvement in Vietnam to Alaska Senator Mike Gravel, one of 2 Unitarian Universalists in the Senate at that time, who read them into the congressional record and took them to Beacon Press, the Unitarian Universalist publishing house, which published what is now known as the Pentagon Papers. 35 other publishers had turned the manuscript down, partly out of fear. The Justice Department had stopped the Washington Post and the New York Times from publishing leaked excerpts. Ellsberg and Gravel's stories read like something out of a spy novel or a Hollywood thriller, and I encourage the other history buffs in the room to go look for that story. You can probably even find video of a panel they were both on in General Assembly in, I think, 2015 in Portland, Oregon. Days after the publication of the Pentagon Papers' full text by Beacon Press, FBI agents went to the Unitarian Universalist Association's bank and asked for the UUA's financial records. The UUA and Senator Gravel sued the government. The case ultimately went to the Supreme Court, where they lost. In his dissenting opinion, Justice William O. Douglas said that it was not Beacon Press who broke the law, but our government. Toribio Quimada was born in the Philippines in 1917 and grew up in a family of farmers. Poverty led that family to move in with a Protestant relative when Toribio was young. Although 90% of the Philippines was Catholic, Toribio was delighted to be able to read the Bible himself, something which was forbidden by the priests in that particular time and place. He converted to Protestantism and joined a church called the Iglesia Universal de Cristo. Toribio became an active member, starting out teaching Sunday school and eventually becoming ordained as a minister. When he took responsibility for 7 congregations just after World War II, he realized they did not have the resources to provide adequate numbers of hymn books, Bibles, or other educational materials. He reached out to other churches to ask for help. After discovering a list of churches in the United States, he looked under the letter U, hoping to find another branch of the Iglesia Universal. Instead, he found several Universalist churches. The one in Gloucester, Massachusetts, responded with some educational materials and offers of financial help. For his ongoing contact with the Universalists and for using their educational materials, Toribio was excommunicated from his church. Not long after, he started the Universalist Church of the Philippines and began a Faith in Action traveling across the countryside to speak with poor farmers, spreading not only universalist ideas and values, but also agitating politically and helping the farmers acquire deeds to their land, blocking corporate tactics of buying up land that had been worked but not officially owned by the same family for generations. He also ran for office but was defeated. The opposition's slogan, "If you vote for Quimada, you will become a universalist," caused great terror in an area dominated by corrupt government and the authoritarianism of the Catholic Church. Just before Toribio was set to travel to the UU General Assembly in 1988 to receive recognition of his church's acceptance into the Unitarian Universalist Association, a process which had taken many years, and a change in UUA bylaws to allow for a church outside of the United States to become a member, he was murdered. Although nobody has ever been charged with the crime, it is believed that his continued social justice work on behalf of poor farmers frightened those in charge enough for them to end his life. These are just a few of the stories of Unitarians and Universalists who did their best to make the world a better place, even when people told them they couldn't or shouldn't do it, even when they were labeled rebels or heretics. They listened to their hearts and their consciences, and they did what they believed was right. May we always do our best to follow their example. Amen, and blessed be.
As Reverend Diana extinguishes the sanctuary chalice, please extinguish your chalice at home, and those of you here, please say the words with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
As we prepare to leave our time of shared worship, may we live our faith as boldly as the ancestors we heard about today.